Yeah, I end up talking a lot about young adult literature. I teach young adult literature sometimes at Upper Iowa. and I think that there are a lot of things that you can explore with young adult literature. There are ways in which I like the way it kind of, as a category, defines certain themes that can be created. And I've been thinking about different kinds of stories. You know, if we're going to talk, can you hear okay?
Use the mic.
Louder in the back!
Use the mic.
Closer to the mic.
Hold the mic closer to you or something. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So you can speak directly into it.
Like that?
Yeah, that's it.
Great. You know, I sometimes like to create these kind of categories of people, like a dichotomy, you know, putting them into two different sets. Jeremy and I often have talked about the sort of the Muppet, Chaos Muppet versus Order Muppet, you know. So you have your Chaos Muppet is like Animal, and your Order Muppet is Kermit, and Miss Piggy is a Chaos Muppet. And they're probably, most of them, Chaos Muppets. It's probably like the nature of Muppetry. But we talk about that kind of thing. And I think, you know, we talked today also in Jeremy's class about the dichotomy between the plotter and the pantser, like the writer who plots everything out before they write it, or the pantser who's like sort of flying by the seat of their pants and excited to see what comes next without necessarily knowing or having it all outlined. And I was thinking about, you know, in this kind of global catastrophe, in a pandemic, I find myself drawn to disaster stories, stories of things going wrong. I like the zombie movies and the horror stories, the science fiction where everything falls apart, or the dystopian stories. And I was thinking some people probably, when they feel this kind of disordered chaos all around them, probably seek out comforting reads. They seek out things that they read a long time ago, or, you know, the Jane Austen's, a mystery novel where everything's kind of tied up at the end and in a little bow. But I find myself wanting to read stories of everything going wrong. And I was thinking, why is that? Like, why, you know, and maybe those two types of people. You drawn to the comfort, or you want to see the ways in which the world could be even worse. And I think that's possibly why we read those kinds of disaster stories, because we want to be able to tell ourselves, well, it could always be worse. Unfortunately, in 2020, that's every day. But you know, there is a certain comfort in knowing that in these fictional worlds, we're watching the ways in which we're actually okay in some ways, right? We can still go to Hy-Vee, sort of. You know, and then in young adult literature, there's that specific kind of understanding in the science fiction story, or the disaster story, or the dystopian story, where it's sort of that transition from childhood to adulthood. The first understanding that, you know, everything is terrible, that the world isn't a safe place, evil exists, that no one, not even adults, really know what they're doing, that people in positions of power have unearned authority, that nobody really knows what they're doing. And it's that first understanding that you think that there's this ordered and understood and intelligent adult world, and then as you get closer to that world, you realize, you know, no, the world can be full of terrible people and terrible things, and that's part of leaving childhood behind, is understanding that. You know, knowing that those in charge maybe don't always have your best interest at heart. But I, you know, it sounds really grim, but I think that's a necessary step, right? Learning that your parents aren't infallible, that they're just people who are doing their best. That this is all a part of the journey that a young adult might be on, and the other side of that is a kind of adulthood that hopefully leads them to be more empathetic, and kinder and more patient and more understanding. But sometimes that remains to be seen. Sometimes they're formed by the world around them. But hopefully one of the things that literature can do while showing us like how bad things can actually get, it can also show us that story that resolves and gives us an ending that provides some kind of hope. And something to look towards, right? Because that's also the story of the young adult, is at the end of that story, it's asking that young person, okay, you realize that the world is a mess. How could you maybe try to fix it? What can you do different and what can you do better? So there's that inherent hopefulness in it as well. So Cut Off is a story that I wrote. Does anyone know the TV show on the History Channel called Alone? Yeah. So it's a show where they drop people, survivalist experts, into the middle of the wilderness, and they have to survive. Just get food for themselves. It's not like the show Survivor, where they have challenges and games to play, and they're given rice. They're given very little. They have some tools, a bow and arrow. And they have to survive in the wilderness, and they're all separated. They're all by themselves, and they're given a GPS phone. And when they hit the GPS phone, somebody comes and rescues them because they're done, they're tapped out. And on this show, which I think we've watched every season of, on this show, whenever they do hit that button, it's always this moment of utter desperation. They might have broken a limb, they might have some kind of infection that's raging, they're starving, they've lost 30% of their body weight, they can't find food, their shelter burned down, and it's negative 15 degrees outside, and so they hit that button. And we were sitting there watching this, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be just awful if nobody answered? If you find you had this thing and it was your safety net, it was the thing that was going to get you out, and you hit it, and like nobody came. Nobody rescued you. And not only are you now stuck out there and you have to continue to survive, you don't know what happened in the rest of the world. So that's the story I wanted to end up telling here. Cut Off is a story of a very similar reality show, except for it's young people, it's teenagers. And they're dropped in the wilderness, and whoever doesn't tap out wins $1 million. But of course, things go wrong. So I'm going to start by reading the prologue of the story. Prologues are a hotly debated topic, especially for some reason in young adult books. There are some people who say you can never have a prologue. I happen to love a prologue. I love prologues when I'm reading, and I seem to write them. So this is a prologue, and it's useful because it sets up the story. Instead of taking all this time to introduce the reader to the show itself and what's the technology of the show, this kind of sci-fi technology that exists, and also what is wrong, which I can't do with my main characters because they have to kind of slowly discover what's wrong. They don't know yet. But I wanted the reader to know that while these people are still trying to survive out in the wilderness, what the reader knows and what they don't is that, they're already screwed. Brandon McKay is going to die. That's what he thinks as he stumbles, gasping and bleeding through the forest. But he's determined. That's what's important. He's got grit and willpower, and no way will he let a reality show be the thing that kills him. Everything was fine until the earthquake. Everything was fine. He was surviving, no doubt better than anyone else on the show. He'd caught fish, built a great shelter, and actually had a decent shot at winning this whole thing. He'd already started planning what to do with the money after the show, buy a new car, pay off his parents' house, maybe backpack to exotic destinations, have adventures, live it up, embrace his inner adrenaline junkie. He's over that now, though. The next trip he takes, there'll be feather pillows and room service. There'll be hospitals. He'd trade every cent of the $1 million prize for a morphine drip right now. He clutches his side. The blood on his fingers is thick and sticky. Was the earthquake only yesterday? It seems longer. He was ascending a rock face when it happened, trying to get to higher ground, have a look around. He'd balanced on a scraggy bit of ledge, figuring he looked pretty good on the skim camera hovering just above his head. The skims were sophisticated, definitely expensive. Top-of-the-line drone cameras that did all the filming for cutoff, creating a 3D virtual reality experience for the folks back home. Brandon's climb gave them a pretty sweet panorama. Those viewers who dropped the $900 on the cutoff virtual reality visors were sure getting their money's worth. Not that Brandon was simply performing for the camera. He had plans, like signing a first-class endorsement deal with a sporting goods company or an energy drink. Eventually, he'd have his own show. Getting picked for cutoff was just the start for him. High on that cliff, it all felt inevitable, a sure thing. Then the world shook and knocked him right off the side of it. He dropped 20 feet to the ground and lay there dazed, staring into the blue sky, waiting for the rest of the mountain to crash down on him. When it was over, he sat up to find that a branch as wide as his finger had torn through the side of his t-shirt. For a second, he couldn't make sense of it, and then his mind clicked together that it hadn't ripped through his shirt, it had ripped through him, his muscle and flesh. That was when the pain hit, and he screamed. Lying there, pierced through the gut, a swelling knob on his head and blood soaking into his clothes, his first thought was about the damn show and how he couldn't win now. The producers would swarm him, pull him from the game, and that was it. Over and out for Brandon McKay. He barely lasted 3 weeks. That wasn't enough time for fame and endorsements, not enough time to become a household name. He was hurt, and yes, scared, but mostly he was pissed. Even though it was obvious he was out of the game, for the sake of the drama, he yelled up at the flittering skim, "Hey, come and get me, I'm tapping out." While he waited, he used the time to his advantage, chatting with the camera, putting on a steadfast, heroic front. There was an audience behind that dead glass eye, and it'd be his last chance to connect with them, perhaps turn his bad luck into something that would look gutsy and badass. The first hour passed, and then another. Where were they? He reached for his bag, the wound screaming at him as he drew his body off the branch. He dug out the beacon and pressed the red tap-out button. He didn't know how it worked, but it was supposed to send out his GPS location, alert the producers that he was quitting. They were supposed to answer. Instead, he was met with silence. When darkness came, he knew something was wrong, really wrong. That all happened yesterday, when he still thought the camera was sending a signal to the audience, the producers, the crew. Now he doesn't know what to think. He wasn't about to lie there rotting in the woods, so he's been walking since morning. As if things couldn't get worse, he's pretty sure something is following him. Something big, a wolf or a wild boar. He can hear it in the bush. It smells the blood that soaks his pant leg, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. He needs to lie down, rest a minute, that's all. But every time he slows, the trees rustle with a noise like a creature stalking through dry leaves. His limbs tingle, and some distant part of him knows that's bad. A low growl rumbles from the forest. Brandon walks faster, but he can't keep going like this much longer. Just as the darkest thoughts, the ones he's held at bay all morning, threaten to tumble forward, hitting him like an avalanche of rocks, he sees a trailer. A sound escapes him that he doesn't recognize as his own, part whimper, part laugh. The relief is so strong and sudden, he feels like throwing up. The trailer is white and broad, a relic of the civilized world in the middle of nowhere. Among the blue design swirls decorating the side and under the window, someone has slapped a decal of the show's logo, cut off, with an image of the earth within the O, and bows, arrows, and fierce animals bordering the perimeter. It's the producer's trailer, like a base camp. Brendan doesn't care anymore that they didn't show up right away. They're here. They found him. And everything will be okay. The earthquake knocked out his skim signal, killed his beacon's GPS, but everything is okay now. He's safe. With a groan, he pushes the door open and falls to the floor, the skim flittering in after him. He lifts his eyes to find no one. It's empty. Terrified of whatever beast has been tracking him, he kicks the door shut and turns the lock. "Hello," he calls, his voice wet with pain and desperation. "Hello." Brendan drops his pack, and drags himself across the gray carpet. With his last bit of strength, he hauls himself into a chair at a bank of computer screens. There's a smartphone at the desk next to a half-eaten tuna sandwich and a partially full bottle of water. Brandon guzzles the water and shoves the sandwich in his mouth. The tuna tastes sour. He doesn't care. Where is everybody? What happened here? Blood smears the buttons of the console as he presses them. At first methodically, then with increasing panic. The computer boots up to reveal the show's logo, but there's no signal, no internet, no sign of anyone or anything. The console phone is silent, the cell phone has no signal. One of the computer monitors flickers on and the black and white screen glows to life. 12 scenes divide the screen, 7 of them blank and 5 showing the remaining contestants. Footage from their skims. One of them is building a fire, another fishing. And there he is, Brandon, in the image on the bottom right, hunched over the desk. At first glance, he doesn't recognize himself, and for a moment he thinks that guy's screwed. His face is drawn and his blood shows black on the monitor. How can that be him? His hopes of winning the show might be over, but if that skim is still filming, he's giving it a goddamn story. A drama is what he's giving it. Hey, he yells at the footage of the 4 other people. Hey, someone, I need help. The contestants don't react. They can't hear him, of course. He lays his head on the desk and cries long enough to come back to himself, and then he cries some more. Rolling the chair across the trailer, he brings himself to the couch. As he eases onto the pillows, his wound oozes more blood, but it doesn't hurt as much now. It's a throb, constant and relentless, but no longer piercing. As the pain retreats, he finds himself using it as a gauge to make sure he's alive. Suddenly he wishes he could see the outside. After so many days, he thought it'd be a relief to finally be indoors, out of the forest, on a soft couch. But he's always been happiest outside. He craves fresh air, the clear space of a cloudless sky, the rush of a breeze. The somber trailer with its dingy carpet, plastic chairs, and moldering smell, it isn't what he wants in this moment. There's a poster tacked on the wall, mountains with snowy crests, green fields below, a spray of wildflowers, yellow, violet, iridescent blue. In the black border on the bottom is the word escape. Brandon lets his gaze settle on the image while he rests, just until he can figure out what to do next. He needs to find the main camp. Surely someone will be there. He imagines what the crisp air would taste like on top of that mountain. The pain has slipped away entirely now, and that's nice. His fingers grow numb, then colors drain from the wildflowers until they and everything around them turn gray. Brandon's hand drops from the couch. The skim bobs overhead for a long time, its signal transmitting to the screen 3 feet away, until at last its battery wears down in the gloom-ridden room. It settles gently to the carpet, and its red eye blinks off. So that's the prologue of the story. I remember when I was writing it, I kept going back and forth between the first line being Brandon McKay is going to die and Brandon McKay is not going to die. And I was trying to figure out which way I wanted to play with the reader because, by the way, Brandon McKay has died. He doesn't come back into the story. And instead, we start in on the sort of novel proper with the opening of the show. And here's where we meet our main characters, and I'll read a little bit of that as well. Chapter 1. Prospective contestant, River Aiden, age 17, height 6 foot, eyes blue, hair dark brown. Student, online education, Clallam County, Washington. Emergency contacts James Irwin, uncle, Seattle, Washington. Eleanor Irwin, grandmother, Tucson, Arizona. Parents deceased, accidental death, car accident. Second round interview excerpts. Interview conducted by supervising producer Gregory Hitchens. By the way, young adult books really like to kill off parents, and I'm no different. You got to get rid of them. If someone's going to grow up, you got to get rid of their parents. So this starts with an interview. Interview conducted by supervising producer Gregory Hitchens. Hitchens. Now is the time in our interview when you can ask any nagging questions you might have for us. River. How much longer will all this take? I figured since you guys came to me, asked me to apply, there wouldn't be this whole process. Hitchens. Well, there's another interview in the psych eval, and if you're selected, you'll have the wilderness survival training. Though you hardly need it, you'll have to participate in the training if you're selected. Liability and all that. It's fundamentals, fire starting, shelter building, that kind of thing. Should be a piece of cake for you, otherwise the selection process is variable. So I'd guess another week, and then we'll do some paperwork. My uncle is the one who really wanted me to do this. I'm not so sure. He told us you'd be perfect for this when we spoke to him, and I have to say your application is the best of the bunch. It's good stuff, River. You're not second-guessing, are you? I don't know. We're on camera the whole time? Hitchens. That's right. Our skim cameras will follow your entire journey on the show, transmitting the whole thing in 3D on a virtual reality platform. River. So they're what, like drone cameras? Yes, but much more sophisticated. The skim recognizes your face, your clothes, it zooms in and out with changes in your expression. It's programmed to stay with you at all times, no matter what. And the cameras are self-sustaining? They require very little maintenance. You only need to change out the solar battery charges once a day. I won't lie, River. We want you on the show, but you're right. It's a commitment. And you need to figure out if it's what you really want. You filled out the application and you've come this far in the process. Why do all that? You must have your reasons. River. Can I do it alone? Hitchens. Of course. Other contestants will end up working together, probably. It'll give them an advantage, but there's nothing that says you have to if you don't want. River. Yeah, I work better alone. End recording. Evaluation. River Aiden is thoughtful but reserved. That's where the risk in casting him lies. He's not forthcoming. He's unlikely to share his journey with the viewers in a way that allows them to connect. Honestly, his interaction with the skim will produce more dead air than anything. Our observations and psych profiles suggest something interesting beneath the surface. We're hoping it'll come out in the tense conditions of the show. Otherwise, he's competent. With his skills, has a better chance of keeping the show going than with some of the other contestants we've chosen so far. I'd put money on him sticking it out for the long haul. Recommendation: accept in advance to final interview screening. The frigid water of the ocean seeped into River's bones, dragging him down. He'd made a string of bad decisions, and now here he was, sinking. It was his own fault. He should have changed the skim battery yesterday. 1 minute it had been fluttering high above the water, then it had dropped several yards from shore, splashing like a stone. He'd instinctively plunged after it. Within minutes, the skim had floated out of reach, and a rogue wave crashed on top of him. He was in over his head and had no idea which way was up. He'd been overconfident. He was weak, tired, pretending the past few weeks of sparse diet and sleepless nights weren't affecting him. For the first time, he regretted the deal he'd made with Uncle Jim. Stick it out on the show until the end, or at least 6 months, and Jim would give it a rest about the military academy and pay for a year of travel. This time next year, River expected to be backpacking the Appalachian Trail, taking as long as he liked. No cameras, no audience, no show. Just him, alone. It was a good deal. He knew a lot about wilderness survival. He just hadn't bargained on electronic contraptions tumbling from the sky. If only he hadn't left his camp across the bay. It was solid and dry, tons of fish. A blue plastic barrel had washed up on his beach after the earthquake 3 days ago, and he'd used it as a giant bobber, fixing trot lines to it and letting it drift in the currents where trout gathered. His arms felt heavy, as if weighed down with lead, but he also had the odd sensation that gravity had become a spent force. The ocean had swallowed him up, and he thought perhaps he was drowning. Images of home flitted past his eyes, his parents laughing on their rambling front porch, hiking the trails behind the house with his best friend, everyone grilling fresh-caught perch over a fire. He swam and reached the floating skim. Tendrils of seaweed grazed his body, and tiredness spread through his limbs. He felt no desire to spend the last of his energy making it back to shore. Maybe he could float for a while, bob along on the waves like the dead skim. If he could just rest for a bit, not worry about anything. His mother, in front of the campfire, picking the tiny bones from a perch. She made her face. It wasn't her favorite fish. Work it out, River. It was like when she'd wake him up in the morning to mow the lawn. Leave me alone, I'm tired. Get over it. Swim. She was right. He probably shouldn't die like this. It would piss her off. He summoned a last reserve of strength, grabbed the skim clipped to his belt, then struggled for shore in the distance. How had he gotten so far out? He swam, arms aching, and when he finally touched ground, he couldn't take a single step. All that struggle in the water had been for nothing. It'd be just as easy to die here as in the ocean. He was wet and cold, had no fire or dry clothes. Too late to do anything about that now. He dropped onto the sand, and his lost thought was that the tide would pull him back out again, and his bones would become coral. When he opened his eyes, he found he wasn't dead, so there was that. The sun was too bright, the birds circled overhead. They dove in and out of his line of sight, swooping for fish. The sound of crashing water was distinct from the rushing noise in his head. So the ocean was on his right, the skim was grounded to his left, green light gleaming and pointed directly at him. His skim was recovered and charged. He somehow was still alive, and he was, it seemed, naked, which wouldn't have been a big deal except for the skim staring at him. His next thought was that something was on fire. He was on fire. Smoke cloaked his lungs, and he gasped himself upright. He shivered as a mylar blanket slipped from his chest. A fire roared in a pit beside him. His jacket, shirts, pants, and socks hung from a nearby branch like a string of dead fish. His boots hung upside down on two stakes pointed toward the fire. It looked comical, as though someone had been buried in the dirt with their feet sticking up. I'll stop there.
Hey, well, I want to thank you for answering the question I always have about the survivalist kind of reality TV shows. Like, they're really that dangerous? There's a camera crew right there. So no, there really is no camera crew right there. So yes, it is that dangerous.
Yeah, on that show alone, it is that dangerous. Like, it could go really wrong, couldn't it? Yeah.
All right, so we want to make sure that this all can be done in an hour, but I do want to give a little time if there are any questions. You might have to shout, and I might have to repeat. But we do have time for a couple. Yeah.
Yeah, so in between the time from starting, from when you got the idea for this story and from when you published it, how much did the story overall change?
How much did it change? That's a good question. So one of the things that was different in the experience of writing this book than in other times that I've written things is that this book was contracted as a outline, basically, with sample pages. And so it was the first time I'd had to write an outline for anything. I was talking about the pantser versus the plotter. I was like, suddenly had to be a plotter because I had to sort of sell this idea and say, okay, they want to know everything that happens and how it ends. So I did have it pretty mapped out. In concept, it changed a number of times, but once I did that outline, there were still some moments that surprised me and that kind of snuck up on me that I enjoyed. But I wrote it probably from, I was on sabbatical, so it would have been like February to May or June. And so it was pretty tight, and it was on a deadline. This is probably one of the books that I could say didn't actually change a whole lot. Like, there was tons of editing, obviously, as with everything. But in concept, it remained pretty stable. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
Apart from the show, what inspired you?
Thank you. Apart from the show, well, the premise of the show sort of triggered the idea, right? Like, there's the show and that what if question, right? What if nobody came? What if nobody showed up? And then there are some sci-fi elements, and I've always, read pretty widely in science fiction from when I was a kid or something, and Ray Bradbury was one of my favorite writers. And it's very different than a Ray Bradbury story, but having this kind of twistiness to it, and the turns that it takes, I would say are influenced by my kind of science fiction interests. And then also, and this is going to sound odd, but I also have often liked Stephen King. And so there are some horror elements. It's an interesting book to categorize because it has elements of of horror in it. It has elements of science fiction, has a little bit of romance. So yeah, I think those would be probably some of the influences, I would say. Yeah.
So you have like the bio and then the interview section.
Yeah.
How much of like the bio or the character kind of sketch do you have in that plot, and how much of the character kind of has surprised you with like the Bible element?
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. I do have in the book. It's interspersed at various times with interview segments and different kinds of media and little bits and bobs throughout the story. And so the question was, how much did that? I'm sorry.
How much did you like plot the character using that, and how much of it was the character surprised?
Did the character maybe kind of try to steer themselves away from that? Well, certainly with especially the sort of interview bits, it's a little bit. I'm not going to call it a cheat. It's a shorthand, right? It's a way to sort of give the reader information in an efficient way. Here is who this character is. Here is someone else's evaluation of this character. Like, so for instance, the producers are saying, like, here's these qualities I see in this person. And in a way that sets up the character for the particular journey that they're going to be on, right? So if River is observed as being kind of a little bit tightly wound and a little bit closed off, like, what does he have to learn as he goes through this story? Because there's premise, of course, but the premise is always going to be just a part of the story, because you also have these characters. And it's not enough to just put your characters in a situation. They have to react to it. They have to be affected by it. They have to have some kind of autonomy that guides them, and then also it teaches them something in some way, right? So it's a little bit of a beacon to the reader, like here is who this person is, and then here's an idea of where they might need to be going. Who are they? What do they want? What do they need? And sometimes in revision, I probably went back and kind of reinforced those ideas. And so went back to the interviews and sort of hammered it a little more, like, oh, here's who this person turned out to be a little bit. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, well, let me just say, give us a minute to get set up back there. We'll have, Adrianne will be signing copies, cut off. We have hardbacks for $15, and we have copies of previous book, Your One and Only, for $10. I can take credit cards, I'm pretty sure. So anyways, thank you all for coming out on such a hot night. Really appreciate it. Hope you'll be back next month.